I'm not gonna lie, it's taken me a good 5 tries to even find a way to open this video. There's just too much wrapped up in those fateful numbers. Things that have had horrific impacts for America itself, entire ethnicities, socio-political upheavals, and everything in between. Every year 9/11 rolls around and we at least try to talk about it again. Almost 20 years later, at least to me, the images and footage of the event is still burned into my brain. I remember seeing it unfold on TV, and after visiting the Ground Zero memorial set up in place of the towers in New York City, that feeling of profound horror and loss on such a massive scale was unlike anything else. In the worlds of entertainment, the ramifications were both immediate and wide-reaching. Various developers changed entire projects, creative movements were put in place to react and adapt to a post-9/11 world, and you can still see a lot of the fallout today. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and this is how gaming has changed since 9/11. Number 6. Bringing combat to your front door. Before 2001, the go-to setting of choice for most games was rooted in fantasy. Hyrulean kingdoms, green hill zones, expansive otherworldly realms, or just anywhere that enhanced escapism. That's not to say that no games had city backdrops, but they were very few and far between. If you were a soldier fighting a war, you were 99% going to be in a world war setting. After 9/11 though, the reality of large-scale domestic terrorism became all too real, and with shows like 24 being conceptualized as a way to show one everyday person fighting back, so too did the active agency of video games play directly into that. Franchises shifted to see you fighting your way through city streets and familiar locales. Call of Duty set its first installment in the modern day. The follow-up to Crysis ditched its jungle setting as scores of first-person shooters started to lead with Americanized settings and taking back your land thematics. Number 5. An end to 90s envelope pushing. There was a whole movement in the 90s gaming scene that essentially felt like we're just seeing what we can get away with. Mirroring other mediums doing the same, the likes of punk rock and music, film's video nasty period, or the whole fascination with apocalyptic event movies, gaming in the 90s gave us Mortal Kombat, Carmageddon, Doom, Unreal Tournament, and more. They remain some of my all-time favorites, but there was always that question of where any of this stuff would end. Would the public ever get too grossed out or otherwise sick of the media depicting gruesome scenes? Whilst we can point to the general maturity of the art form and many developers or consumers growing up, there's no denying that post 9/11 it was in increasingly poorer taste to make games about macabre subject matter. This rebel period all but went away, and even Rockstar moved on to more refined games with the likes of the more considered GTA 4. Number 4. Removing the Twin Towers from everything. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, it was considered too raw and emotionally charged to include imagery of the Twin Towers in anything. TV shows and movies edited around previously shot scenes or sequences, with something like The Simpsons' The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson episode being taken off the air for years, until it was at least deemed more acceptable for it to return. In gaming, the Twin Towers are still seldom seen, and were actively removed from things like Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro, Command & Conquer Red Alert 2, and Siphon Filter 3. I can only really think of one example where a game made post-2001 still included the towers themselves. That game was 2006's Driver Parallel Lines, and it had a less complete version of the towers in its 1978 levels, mirroring the state of construction the towers were in at the time, which then changed to a building site when the game returned to 2006. This latter approach is far more common, rather than games revisit a time period like the late 90s when it might still be too near the knuckles seeing the towers as they were before 9/11 itself. Interestingly as well, for whatever reason, 2018 Spider-Man forwent including the current Ground Zero Memorial or the Freedom Tower, potentially showing that this sort of imagery is still a contentious issue depending on the creator. Number 3. Using the Middle East as a setting in everything. It came to something when even Beyond Two Souls featured Ellen Page as a soldier sleuthing her way through bombed-out buildings with her paranormal friend. Because post 9/11, Middle Eastern settings were everywhere. Army of Two, Call of Duty, Rainbow Six, Ghost Recon, Splinter Cell got in on the action in Conviction, where flashbacks to a younger version of Sam Fisher had him trading bullets on an Iraqi highway. Even Metal Gear Solid 4 pivoted away from America to the Middle East, throwing off fan expectations as it left the cliffhanger from the close of Metal Gear Solid 2 wide open. Chances are, if you've played any action game after 2001, you've played more than your share of Middle Eastern locales, replete with the same dusty roads, tattered flags, and crumbling buildings. Number 2. The nebulous terrorist antagonist in tons of action games. Before Ubisoft showcased Vaas and later Pagan Min, ushering in the era of the wacky antagonist, every single evildoer was a nebulously labeled terrorist, because that was a simple enough go-to for any set of villains. Now, whilst the Middle East was being used frequently across scores of games, actual nationalities of terrorists varied from Russian to Mexican to various regions of Europe. Uncharted 2's Lazarevich, Black Ops' Nikita Dragovich, it felt like every other game saw you up against a gravel-voiced Middle Easterner or a dastardly Russian. Essentially, it was anything other than America, which was why when Spec Ops The Line dropped with its dissection of Martin Walker through quasi-villain John Conrad, it became a cult classic. Only recently have we started to see villains with more nuanced motivations, setting them up for a final fight where we get to save them from themselves rather than just gunning them down and moving on. Number 1. Major game releases were forever changed. Onto a couple of specific game examples. As I mentioned earlier about Metal Gear Solid 2 being changed, in Sons of Liberty the game infamously ends slap bang in the middle of New York City, seeing Raiden and Solidus Snake fight it out above Federal Hall. In the original version, this was meant to be far more detailed, going through multiple iterations that would have included World Trade Center imagery during the sequence back on the tanker, and later on a more notably destroyed New York. Without the area being completely overhauled, this latter scenario kinda had to happen, as Raiden and Solidus needed to get from Arsenal Gear to Federal Hall for the big fight. However, in the end, the version that shipped simply had them fall off Arsenal Gear whilst it was in motion still in the water, only to end up on the top of Federal Hall itself. It might be notably jarring, but the devs were simply out of time, though more detail of the deleted scenes did become available on the document of Metal Gear Solid 2 release. GTA 3 also underwent some very last-minute changes, as it was initially set to release only 2 weeks after 9/11 had happened. Being delayed a month to give Rockstar some breathing room, cop cars were changed from New York City blue and white to black and white, explaining why blue and white cars were seen in early game screenshots. An entire mission featuring terrorists called Love Hurts was also taken out completely, alongside various lines from NPCs that Rockstar didn't think belonged anymore. Lastly, in a move that could have nigh on killed the game if it remained, one plane's flight path was altered so that it went nowhere near the largest skyscrapers in the game. Many have then theorized that this is why the Dodo was infamously unable to fly without specific hidden methods, but Rockstar have never clarified. Either way, 9/11 remains constantly talked about not just on its anniversary, but across the year and forevermore. The utmost respect goes to the first responders and all of those who did what they could on that fateful day, and thank you all very much for listening.